Nuremberg Prison, May 21st, 1946, cell number 5. Hermann Göring sits on the edge of his cot in a faded blue Luftwaffe tunic, the gold braid stripped off months ago by the Americans. His weight has dropped from 264 pounds to 180. The morphine is gone. The medals are gone. The empire is gone. A young U.S. Army psychiatrist named Leon Goldenson pulls up a wooden chair and opens his notebook. Goldenson writes down what Göring says next, word for word. The Americans cannot build aeroplanes. They are very good at refrigerators and razor blades. He's not joking. He still believes it. 5 months from the gallows, and the second most powerful man in the Third Reich still cannot say the sentence out loud that he was wrong. Now hold that quote in your head for 1 second, because while Göring sat in that cell sneering about razor blades, a factory in Ypsilanti, Michigan had already finished its work. 8,685 four-engine heavy bombers, one rolling off the line every 63 minutes. Day, night, Sunday, Christmas. The Americans didn't build refrigerators. They built the thing that bombed Hamburg flat. They built it on Henry Ford's assembly line. And the men who saw it first saw it with their own eyes, from train windows, from prison camp mess halls, from the back of army trucks rolling through Kansas wheat. They were Germans, captured Germans, 378,000 of them. This is what they saw. Kiel, Germany, 1933. A 9-year-old boy named Heino Erichsen watches his country change in a single winter. The new flags go up first. Red, white, the black hooked cross in the middle. Then the new songs at school. Then the new books, and the disappearance of the old ones. By the time Heino turns 10, the law has him. Every boy in Germany between 10 and 14 belongs to the Jungvolk. Every boy between 14 and 18 belongs to the Hitlerjugend. There is no opt-out. There is no Sunday off, especially not Sunday. Every weekend on Saturdays and Sundays, you had to go to class, Erichsen wrote decades later in his memoir, which intentionally prevented you from going to church. Read that twice. The Reich didn't just want their bodies. The Reich wanted the time slot God used to have. So what did they teach him in that time slot? They taught him that America was a joke, a mongrel country, a nation of Negroes and Jews and Italians and Irishmen who couldn't agree on a language, much less an army. They taught him that Wall Street was Jewish, that Hollywood was Jewish, that Roosevelt was a cripple controlled by Bernard Baruch. They taught him that the United States in 1917 had only entered the last war because British propaganda fooled them, and that this time, the Americans were too soft, too divided, too obese with chocolate and Coca-Cola to fight. Hermann Göring said it on the radio back in 1936. Guns will make us powerful. Butter will only make us fat. The Americans, he said, had chosen butter. The boy believed it. Why wouldn't he? He was 10. By 1942, Heino is 18, and the Wehrmacht has him. Uniform, rifle. A transport ship across the Mediterranean to North Africa, to a desert war commanded by a man the propaganda films called the Desert Fox, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Heino is assigned to the 22nd Panzer Grenadiers, a private. What he did not know, sitting on that transport, was the math. In 1941, the United States produced more than 26,000 military aircraft, already more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined that same year. In 1942, the figure climbed to 47,836. In 1943, 85,898. In 1944, it would peak at 96,318. By the time Heino's boots touched African sand, the country he had been told was too soft to fight was already outbuilding the entire Axis world combined. Nobody told him that. Nobody could. The German radio said the U-boats had cut America off, that the factories were on strike, that Detroit was burning. The German radio lied. And within a year, Heino Erichsen would meet the truth in person, not on a battlefield, in a mess hall in Texas. May 1943. the northern tip of Africa, the Cape Bon Peninsula, where the desert meets the Mediterranean. The Afrika Korps has run out of two things at once: ammunition and ground. 6 days earlier, on May 7th, the U.S. Army's 2nd Corps, under General Omar Bradley, had taken Bizerte. The British 5th Corps had taken Tunis the same day. Rommel himself was no longer in Africa. Hitler had pulled him out in March, citing his health, leaving Generaloberst Hans-Jürgen von Arnim to surrender what was left. What was left was 250,000 men. The official U.S. campaign history's count of Axis prisoners taken in Tunisia in the second week of May 1943, more than 275,000, German, Italian, mixed. The U.S. Army's official record calls it the largest mass capture of the European theater up to that point. More German soldiers walked into Allied cages in those 14 days than had surrendered 3 months earlier at Stalingrad. Heino Erichsen, 18 years old, private, 22nd Panzer Grenadiers, is one of them. He had been told since the age of 10 what to expect from this moment. The Americans would shoot them, or rob them, or hand them to French colonial troops who would do worse. Goebbels' propaganda ministry had spent 4 years telling German soldiers that surrender meant atrocity, that the Geneva Convention was a Jewish lie, that American soldiers were gangsters in uniform. Then the Americans showed up. What Ernst Flute, another German captured in the same weeks, wrote down later was this: "Almost immediately, Red Cross ambulances drove up and took care of our wounded, German wounded, loaded into American ambulances by American medics. No questions asked about which uniform." Erichsen wrote his own version in a flatter line decades later: "We were safeguarded from mistreatment by our captors." Read that sentence twice and feel the gap between what he was told and what he got. The Americans counted them, tagged them, fed them, took their rifles and their bayonets and their unit identity discs. Then, from transit camps along the Tunisian coast and at Casablanca, moved the prisoners onto Liberty ships. Now consider that ship. 6 months earlier, on November 8, 1942, at 12:01 in the morning, the keel of a Liberty ship called the SS Robert E. Peary had been laid down at Kaiser's Permanente Metals No. 2 yard in Richmond, California. 250,000 parts, 14 million pounds of steel. The ship was launched 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes later. By the spring of 1943, American yards were turning out a Liberty ship roughly every 3 to 4 days, on average 42 days from keel to launch by year's end. By war's end, they would build 2,710 of them. And on May 7, 1943, the very week of the Tunisian collapse, that same Robert E. Peary was already on the run carrying German POWs from Casablanca to Norfolk, Virginia. Heino went aboard one of them. He didn't know its name. He had heard rumors that some POWs were being sent to Britain, others to Canada, a few, the worst rumor, to America itself. He didn't believe that one. America was supposed to be cut off. The U-boats, the strikes, the burning factories. The German radio said so. The ship pointed west. It crossed an Atlantic the Wehrmacht had spent 2 years telling him was sealed. It wasn't. Below deck on a Liberty ship, the air smells like wet steel, diesel, vomit, and tobacco smoke. The German prisoners are packed onto plywood bunks stacked 4 high. American guards walk the catwalks with .45 caliber pistols on their hips. The hold is hot in the day, cold at night, and the engines never stop. This is the part of the story the Wehrmacht never showed in the newsreels. By the end of the war, 378,156 German prisoners had been shipped to the United States. That is Kramer's count, the standard figure. They came over in the empty cargo holds of the same Liberty ships and Victory ships that had just delivered American tanks, food, and ammunition to North Africa. The ships were going back to America anyway. Why send them home empty? This is a small detail. Hold on to it. Now, while Germany's Kriegsmarine was sinking Allied merchant tonnage in the North Atlantic, the 2 largest transatlantic troop ships running between New York and Britain, the Cunard liners Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, were carrying around 15,000 American GIs apiece, every crossing at 30 knots. Faster than any U-boat in service. Neither was ever sunk. Roughly 75% of the American troops who reached the European theater rode on the 2 Queens. The Allied convoy system, the B-24 Liberators flying anti-submarine patrols out of Iceland and Newfoundland, the cracking of the Enigma code at Bletchley Park. By mid-1943, they had closed what U-boat captains called the Mid-Atlantic Gap. German propaganda still called the Atlantic a U-boat lake. By the time Heino Erichsen's ship was sailing west, the lake had a roof on it. After roughly 2 weeks, the engines changed pitch. Reinhold Poebel, a German sergeant who would arrive at Norfolk, Virginia on January 2, 1944, aboard the Empress of Scotland, wrote down what it looked like in his memoir, Enemies Are Human. After delousing on the dock, the prisoners were marched to the railroad station. What was waiting for them was not a freight car, it was a passenger coach. Modern upholstered coaches were a pleasant surprise to everyone, Poebel wrote. And when the colored porter came through with coffee and sandwiches and politely offered them to us as though we were human beings, most of us forgot those anti-American feelings that we had accumulated. Read that one sentence carefully. A black American Pullman porter, walking up to a car full of Nazi soldiers, with a tray of coffee and sandwiches, speaking to them politely. In the propaganda films Heino had watched in the Hitlerjugend, this man was supposed to be a slave, a subhuman, a racial inferior. In the reality of Norfolk railway station, he was a working man on the clock, doing his job, treating prisoners of war exactly the way the Geneva Convention said you treat them. Poebel saw it in January of 1944. Heino had seen the same thing months earlier, on a different train, walking out of Ellis Island in the fall of 1943. This was where the cage started to crack. A Pullman car. Late September 1943. Somewhere between New Jersey and Texas. Heino Erichsen has a window seat. He has not been told where the train is going. American military police walk the aisle in pairs every half hour. The car smells of fresh upholstery and the cigarettes of the guards. Outside the window, America. Not the America the propaganda films had shown him. Not the smoking ruins, the bread lines, the race riots, the striking workers. What Heino sees instead is the thing the German radio had spent 4 years swearing did not exist. Wheat. Thousands of acres of wheat. Then corn. Then more wheat. Then a farm. Then another farm. Then a town with a water tower painted with the name of the town, and a main street with a Ford dealership, a Rexall drugstore, a movie theater with a marquee and lights. Then more farms. Then more towns. Hold on a moment. By 1944, American factories would be producing roughly 2/3 of all the Allied military equipment used in the entire war. By war's end, more than half of all industrial output on planet Earth was rolling out of the United States, a single country with 7% of the world's population. The Corn Belt Heino's train was crossing, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, was feeding the U.S. Army, the British home front through Lend-Lease, and the Soviet Red Army on the Eastern Front simultaneously. Through the war, the United States shipped more than 4 million tons of food alone under Lend-Lease. The German radio had told Heino that this country was starving. He sees a freight train pass in the opposite direction. He counts the cars. He stops counting at 68. Flatbeds stacked with what looks, from this distance, like factory-new Sherman tanks under tarpaulins. Then more flatbeds with airplane fuselages. Then a string of tanker cars marked gasoline. Then boxcars. Then more flatbeds. Then comes Texas. Then comes Camp Hearne, just north of the small town of Hearne in Robertson County. The train pulls into a siding. The doors open. Heino steps down. What happened next, Erichsen wrote in The Reluctant Warrior, was the moment that did the most damage to everything he had been taught. We could take hot showers, eat good food, and we had sports facilities for soccer. Read that and remember where he had just come from. The previous year he had been on the Tunisian front, and by May of 1943, with Allied warships and aircraft cutting every Mediterranean supply line, the Afrika Korps was eating captured British biscuit and drinking water rationed by the canteen. The official Wehrmacht ration of 750 grams of bread a day existed on paper. In Tunisia, at the end, the paper was the only place it existed. The American camp issued meals modeled on the U.S. Army field ration. the caloric intake the Geneva Convention required for American GIs. The first time they served it to him, Erichsen later told an interviewer, he ate, then he went and took a shower. Then he came back and ate again. Then he took another shower, then a third. I took 3 showers a day at first, he said. We got a meal with everything. There was bread and potatoes and dessert, and I thought, well, this is great. Look at that sentence carefully. And dessert. A starving teenage soldier from Kiel, fresh off 2 years in the Sahara, looks at his metal tray in a Texas Army camp. There is dessert. That detail, the dessert, was not in any propaganda film he had ever seen. Pull the train back from Texas for a moment. Wind it backward up the map. Many of the German POW trains coming out of the East Coast didn't go straight to the camps. They ran through the American industrial heartland to get there. The track from New York to Camp Concordia, Kansas. The track from Norfolk to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The track from Boston to Camp Atlanta, Nebraska. They cut through the lungs of the American war economy. Steel mills lighting the sky orange in Gary, Indiana. Pittsburgh's blast furnaces. The Detroit River with shipyards working 3 shifts. Cleveland, Akron, Toledo, and 27 miles west of Detroit, near a small town called Ypsilanti, Michigan, the largest factory under one roof anywhere on Earth. It had a name in the local papers. They called it Willow Run. Stand at the window for a second. Look at what's in there. In January of 1941, 11 months before Pearl Harbor, a Ford production executive named Charles Sorensen flew to San Diego to inspect the Consolidated Aircraft Plant making the B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. Sorensen watched men hand-fitting aircraft outdoors in the California sun. The wings were warping in the heat. The aircraft were going together one at a time, the way a master cabinet maker builds a dresser. Sorensen, the man who had helped Henry Ford design the moving assembly line at Highland Park 3 decades earlier, looked at this and was, in his own words, not impressed. That night, in his hotel room in San Diego, Sorensen sat at the desk with a pencil and a piece of hotel stationery and sketched out a single building, 3,200 feet long, over a mile, 80 acres under one roof, twin assembly lines for a 4-engine bomber with a 110-foot wingspan on a moving line, the way Henry Ford built Model Ts. The next morning, Sorensen showed it to Consolidated's president, Major Reuben Fleet. Fleet was skeptical and offered a counterproposal. Ford could build just 1,000 wing sections. Sorensen replied with a sentence later quoted in every aviation history of the war: "We'll make the whole plane or nothing." 18 months later, the first B-24 Liberator rolled out the doors of the Willow Run plant. By the summer of 1944, a B-24 was rolling out the doors every 63 minutes. 42,500 workers at peak, roughly 12,000 of them women, riveters, electricians, hydraulics technicians, machinists, paid the union scale of about 85 cents an hour, the same as the men. By war's end, this single building had produced 8,685 B-24 Liberators. The B-24 became the most produced American military aircraft in history. Willow Run alone built nearly half of every one ever made. Now hold that number against something else. The Luftwaffe's primary 4-engine heavy bomber, the Heinkel He-177 Greif, Germany's only operational long-range strategic bomber, was produced in a total of roughly 1,169 airframes across its entire production run from 1942 to 1944. 1,169. One factory in Michigan, working from a sketch on hotel stationery, built more than 7 times as many B-24s as the entire Third Reich built of its closest equivalent. Remember Hermann Göring on the radio in 1936? "Guns will make us powerful. Butter will only make us fat." Remember Göring in his Nuremberg cell in 1946? "The Americans cannot build aeroplanes. They are very good at refrigerators and razor blades." Look out the train window, Heino. A German POW train moving through the Detroit Basin in the autumn of 1943 was looking at the largest concentration of industrial production ever assembled by any nation on Earth, before or since. Detroit firms alone produced about 30% of all American war materiel of the entire war, more than any other American city. Japan's total industrial capacity at the time was roughly 1/10 of America's. The big 3 Detroit automakers, Ford, GM, Chrysler, had stopped making civilian cars on February 10, 1942. Every plant was now stamping out tank hulls, aircraft engines, machine gun parts, Jeep chassis. Heino did not have words for what he was seeing. He had no propaganda category for it. Nothing he had ever been told prepared him for the moment a freight train pulled up next to his Pullman at a siding outside Detroit, and he counted, on one passing flatbed alone, the noses of 11 brand-new Sherman tanks. 11. On one car. There were dozens more cars behind it. The German radio had lied about everything. By the autumn of 1943, the town of Hearne, Texas had a population of about 3,500 people. By the following year, there were more Germans behind the wire on the north edge of town than civilians living in the town itself. The locals were not amused. The town had asked for the camp. The civic leaders of Hearne in 1942 had lobbied for a POW facility. They wanted captive labor to replace the boys they had sent overseas. What they got was a 720-acre compound, roughly 150 buildings, wrapped in 1,800 miles of double-stranded barbed wire and 7 floodlit guard towers. A small army under Nazi flags lived 3 miles up the highway from the town's only diner. Within months, the town had a name for the place: the Fritz Ritz. Inside the wire, this is what was happening. Reveille at 5:45 in the morning, lights out at 10 o'clock at night, 3 meals a day, fed on the same caloric standard the Geneva Convention required for American GIs. Hot showers, soccer fields, volleyball courts, a swimming pool the POWs built themselves, an outdoor stage with a concrete orchestra pit, the foundation of which is still there today, a band shell housing the surrendered Afrika Korps military orchestra under conductor Willy Matz, formerly director of the Leipzig Symphony. When Rommel's orchestra surrendered in Tunisia, they had marched into captivity carrying their instruments. The instruments came with them all the way to Robertson County, Texas. Baylor University offered the prisoners correspondence courses in mathematics, agriculture, stenography, and English. German POWs returned to a smashed Europe in 1946, holding college credits from a Baptist university outside Waco. Several came back with diplomas in American government and democracy. Enlisted men picked cotton in the fields outside the wire for 10 cents an hour. Non-commissioned officers, exempt from labor under the 1929 Geneva Convention, spent their days at handicraft. Some of them built a waist-high replica of a Bavarian castle, complete with moat and waterfalls. They called it Burg Schwanstein. Now here is the detail you have to sit with for a second. The American food rations issued to the German POWs at Hearne so far exceeded what civilians outside the wire could buy under wartime rationing that there was a particular moment, documented by the Camp Hearne Museum and by HistoryNet's investigation of the camp, when the POWs ran out of chalk to mark their soccer field lines. They used sugar instead. In a town where a Hearne mother had just scolded her daughter for using the family's monthly sugar ration on a single batch of birthday cookies, the German prisoners of the United States were dumping the white stuff onto the dirt to line a soccer pitch. Read that again and think about Goebbels' radio broadcasts about American breadlines. Paul Goltz, a teenage Wehrmacht conscript captured at Normandy in 1944 and shipped to a camp in the American Midwest, would tell Stars and Stripes in a 2019 interview that the United States was the place he tasted his first Coca-Cola, watched his first Mickey Mouse cartoon at a camp cinema, heard jazz for the first time, met the comedian Red Skelton. Otherwise, Goltz said in 2019 from his home in Pleiserhohen, Germany, "I was a poor farmer's boy. I have seen another life." That is what the inside of a Nazi POW camp in the United States looked like. That is also what made the next thing that happened, in a different barracks at the same compound, so unforgivable. By the autumn of 1943, the American POW camp system held a paradox. On the surface, hot showers, soccer fields, orchestras, college courses, 3 meals a day, Coca-Cola. Below the surface, a second Wehrmacht command structure had reassembled itself behind the barbed wire. Senior NCOs running shadow courts, shadow loyalty enforcers. The beatings had a name: Heiliger Geist, Holy Ghost. The violence came at night, and the victim never knew who had swung the lead pipe. Hitler's Germany had crossed the Atlantic with the prisoners. In a 75-day stretch in the fall of 1943, 3 men found that out. The first was Captain Felix Tropschuh, 30 years old, Afrika Corps veteran at Camp Concordia, Kansas, the largest POW camp in the state, holding more than 4,000 Germans. Tropschuh stopped writing letters home, afraid of the censors in his own barracks, fellow Germans, not Americans, and committed his thoughts to a private diary. A Nazi enforcer cell inside the compound found the diary. On October 18, 1943, Tropschuh was beaten in his quarters. He broke free, ran to the camp gate, flagged down an American guard truck. The truck slowed for a few seconds, then drove away. He begged the American camp commander for protection. The commander shrugged and ordered him returned to his barracks. By 11 p.m. that night, Felix Tropschuh was dead, hanging in his cell. U.S. Army investigators later concluded he had been handed a rope by his fellow Germans and forced to sign a single-line note, "I voluntarily take leave of my life." The second man, on November 4, 1943, was Gefreiter Johannes Kunze of Hamburg, Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma. Kunze had been passing intelligence notes to the American camp doctor during sick call, names of Gestapo operatives among the POWs, German military details. The system collapsed when a substitute American doctor, unfamiliar with the arrangement, handed one of Kunze's notes back through another German prisoner. That night, Hauptfeldwebel Walter Bayer convened a kangaroo court of roughly 200 POWs in the mess hall. Kunze tried to run. He didn't make it to the door. He was beaten with fists and boots and thrown against a concrete wall. American military police found his body in the morning. The third man, on December 17, 1943, was Corporal Hugo Kraus, Camp Hearne, Texas, 25 years old. Born in Germany, raised in New York City from the age of 9. So fluent in English that the Americans had made him a camp interpreter. He listened to U.S. radio in front of his fellow prisoners. He said out loud the one sentence he died for: "America is winning the war." 6 to 10 Nazi loyalists came through his barracks door at midnight with clubs, nail-studded boards, and a length of lead pipe. Heino Erichsen was in a bunk nearby. He heard everything. He said almost nothing about it for decades. The 5 men who killed Johannes Kunze were prosecuted at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, by an Army lieutenant named Leon Jaworski, 3 decades before Jaworski would become the special prosecutor against Richard Nixon. President Roosevelt confirmed their death sentences in October 1944. The 5 were hanged together at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, on July 10, 1945, 2 months after Germany surrendered. 7 men at Camp Hearne were convicted of murdering Hugo Kraus and sentenced to life. Inside an American POW camp in 1943, a German private had 2 enemies. One wore a U.S. Army uniform. The other slept across the aisle. The second one was the one to be afraid of. While Hermann Göring sat in his Nuremberg cell, still calling the Americans builders of refrigerators and razor blades, the man who actually ran the Third Reich's war economy was sitting 200 miles to the north, in a castle on a fjord in Schleswig-Holstein, telling the Americans exactly the opposite. His name was Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production from 1942 to 1945. The architect turned industrialist who had nearly tripled German armaments output in 2 years, using millions of slave laborers, and who, in his own words, would now lecture a U.S. interrogation team for 7 days on what he called bombing high school. The interrogation began on May 15, 1945, at Glücksburg Castle. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, commissioned by President Roosevelt in November of 1944, sent in an unusual team: Wall Street financier Paul Nitze, vice chairman of the survey, Harvard economist John Kenneth Galbraith, the young attorney George Ball, later Undersecretary of State. They had one task: get to Speer before the British arrested him and ask him what no one inside the Reich had been allowed to ask out loud. They asked, he answered. Each morning, Speer came downstairs in a suit and lectured: the architecture of his ministry, raw materials, plant dispersal, bombing damage, Mistakes. He handed Nizza the combination to the safe in Munich where his personal reports to Hitler were locked, and then he handed them this. After the Allied firebombing of Hamburg in late July of 1943, Operation Gomorrah, which killed roughly 42,000 civilians over 7 nights, Speer had told his ministry colleagues, 6 more Hamburgs and Germany will be finished. He repeated the substance of that statement to Nizza and Galbraith. That was July of 1943, 2 years before the German surrender. Hitler's Minister of Armaments had privately conceded the war. He told the Americans why. German aircraft production in 1944 reached 39,807 airframes, the highest in the Reich's history. American production that same year was 96,318. Germany was outproducing nothing. It could not match the Soviet Union east of the Vistula. It could not match the United States across the Atlantic. By late 1944, Speer was quietly diverting Germany's last nitrate production from explosives into fertilizer. Because, he told Galbraith, next year's harvest now mattered more than next year's war. On the morning of May 23, 1945, 8 days after the interrogation began, tanks rolled up to the gates of Glücksburg Castle. American and British troops burst into Speer's bedroom and took him away, first to Camp Ashcan in Luxembourg, then to Nuremberg. When the soldiers came through the door, Speer looked up and said, "So now the end has come. That's good. It was all only kind of an opera anyway." The tribunal at Nuremberg sentenced him to 20 years. 6 years after the war, the Dallas Morning News received a letter. "I am a German former war prisoner and was a reader of your newspaper. Texas became my first tranquil home after harsh years of war. I want back in old Texas, and I can work. Who can help me?" The writer was Hans Joachim Sembach, once a prisoner at the Fair Park camp in Dallas. Sent home to Germany in 1946, tried to slip back into America, caught, returned. Now, in 1951, from a Germany still in rubble, he was begging strangers in Texas to bring him back. Heino Erichsen returned to Germany, found Kiel a smoking ruin, and applied for American citizenship. He became a U.S. citizen in 1958. He lived the rest of his life in Texas. He died there. "I learned the meaning of freedom in a prison camp," he later told an interviewer. "I never knew what America was like before I was a prisoner." Reinhold Pabel never bothered with paperwork. On the night of September 10, 1945, he crawled under 2 strands of wire at the Camp Washington, Illinois branch of Camp Ellis, walked to a highway, hitchhiked to Peoria, and bought a bus ticket to Chicago. He had $10.20 in his pocket. He applied for a Social Security card under the name Philip Brick. The clerk gave him one with no trouble at all. He washed dishes. He clerked in a bookstore. He saved $500 in 3 months and opened his own bookstore on the north side of Chicago. He married an American woman. He had 2 children. The FBI caught up with him in his store in 1953, 8 years after he had walked out of a country he had once been told was a racial joke. And Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal, the man who had stood on the radio in 1936 and said Germany had chosen guns while America had chosen butter, the man who had told Leon Goldenson in his Nuremberg cell that the Americans could only build refrigerators and razor blades, sat in that cell on the night of October 15, 1946, 2 hours before his scheduled execution, and bit down on a glass capsule of potassium cyanide. The hangman never put a rope around his neck, but the verdict stood. Out at Willow Run, the assembly line had stopped that May. 8,685 liberators were scattered across 3 continents. Out at Camp Hearne, the soccer fields were going to weeds. Out at Glücksburg Castle, Albert Speer's safe in Munich had been emptied. Every German private who had stepped off a Pullman car in Norfolk or Hearne or Tonkawa had seen with his own eyes what the Reichsmarshal, alone in a cell with a glass vial of cyanide still hidden in his belongings, refused to say out loud. The razor blades had won the war.